Everyone believed the Mafia boss's baby had been born blind. The doctors confirmed it. Specialists gave up. And even his own father, the most feared man in Boston, lost hope. For months, the child lived in silence, never reacting, never smiling, never seeing. But then a new maid was hired. She had no medical training. She wasn't part of any team. She was just there to clean and help around the house. But what she noticed changed everything. One small moment during a simple bath revealed a truth that no one else had seen. And from that day on, nothing was ever the same again. After the car bomb that killed his wife, Kieran Blackwood shut himself inside his massive estate. He didn't want to see anyone. He didn't want to talk to anyone. The only thing that mattered to him now was his baby boy, Asher. But Asher had been born blind. The doctors told Kieran that the baby's eyes didn't respond to light at all. It was a crushing diagnosis. Since then, Kieran has done everything he can to take care of him. He feeds him, bathes him, holds him. He never hires a nanny. He never trusts anyone. His whole life is wrapped around the child. But Asher just sits quietly. He doesn't cry, doesn't laugh. His little face always looks blank. His eyes stare off into nothing. It's like the baby doesn't even know anyone is there. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like if you're already hooked. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? In the weeks that followed, Kieran Blackwood did everything within the reach of a man with power and money. He brought in the best experts from across the United States to the estate to examine Asher. The most renowned ophthalmologist in Boston came, performed his tests, then shook his head. A pediatric neurologist from New York flew in with advanced equipment and left again with regret written plainly on his face. But the one Kieran pinned his greatest hope on was Dr. Harold Brennan, the pediatrician Boston's upper class trusted without question. He came to the estate 3 times. Each visit, he examined the baby with meticulous care, then prescribed a medication he said would stimulate a newborn's nervous system. "Waiting is the only way, Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Brennan said with polished professionalism. "Give the boy his medicine regularly. Time will answer." Kieran believed him. He had no reason to doubt a physician with a reputation like that. He gave Asher the medicine every day, on time, at the right dose, waiting for a miracle that never came. Therapists appeared one after another and vanished just as quickly. A vision therapist arrived with complicated exercises, but Asher didn't respond to any stimulus. A child development specialist proposed early intervention methods, but every effort was like pouring water into sand. They came, they tried, they sighed, and then they went. Each time a specialist left the estate with that same small shake of the head, Kieran felt another piece of hope inside him splinter and fall away. He began to buy things with a kind of frantic obsession. Visual stimulation machines worth tens of thousands of dollars were delivered. Colorful light-up toys piled high in the nursery. Sound therapy equipment was installed everywhere, playing melodies said to stimulate an infant's brain. Kieran tried it all. He flashed lights in front of Asher's face, shook toys that chimed and sang. He even hired a composer to create special pieces of music. But Asher remained like a small statue made of wax. He didn't turn his head. He didn't blink. There was no sign, not even the faintest, that he was aware of the world around him. Late night became the most frightening time for Kieran. When the estate sank into darkness and silence settled over every corner, he often sat alone in his study. The room was vast, its bookcases rising all the way to the ceiling, firelight from the hearth dancing along the walls, and a wedding photograph resting on his desk. Kieran stared at that picture for hours at a time. Catherine in her white dress, her smile radiant, her eyes bright with happiness. She was so beautiful it made his heart ache every time he looked at her. "What am I supposed to do?" Kieran whispered to the photograph, his voice rough from nights without sleep. "Tell me. I'm losing our son. I don't know what else to do." But Catherine didn't answer. She would never answer again. Kieran felt as though he were slowly sinking inside this very house. With each passing day, he lost another part of himself. He was no longer the terrifying Mafia kingpin all of Boston feared. He was only a desperate father, helpless before the cruel fate of his only child. One night, as Kieran sat in the study the way he always did, a soft knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Harmon, the housekeeper who had worked for the Blackwood family for 20 years, stepped in with hesitation on her face. She was a tall, thin woman, gray hair neatly pinned up, always dressed in black as if she were in mourning for the entire house. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to tell you something." Kieran didn't look up. Speak. I'm old now, sir. 72. My legs aren't what they used to be. My back hurts every time I bend down. This house is too large. I can't carry all the work by myself anymore. Kieran was silent. He'd known this day would come. Mrs. Harmon had served his family longer than anyone, but time spared no one. You should hire someone else. Mr. Blackwood, she continued, a young housemaid, strong and healthy, who can handle the heavy work. Kieran's hand tightened into a fist. Hiring someone new meant letting a stranger step into this house, into his life, into the space he was trying to protect for Asher. He trusted no one, not after what had happened to Catherine, but as he looked at Mrs. Harmon standing there, her back bent, her hands unsteady, Kieran knew he had no other choice. All right, he said, his voice exhausted. Find someone. No need for talk, just work. Mrs. Harmon nodded, letting out a breath of relief. She turned and left, and Kieran was alone again with the darkness and the weight of his thoughts. He didn't know that this decision would change everything. He didn't know the new housemaid would bring what no expert had been able to. And that was how Nora Sinclair was hired into the Blackwood estate. Nora Sinclair arrived at the Blackwood estate early one morning in the first days of October, when fog still lay thick over the rows of trees lining the road into Boston's wealthiest suburb. She stood before the enormous iron gate, her left hand holding a small cloth bag with a few old changes of clothes, her right hand gripping the employment contract that had been signed the week before. The gate rose more than 3 meters high, its wrought patterns curling in intricate loops. An ornate letter B set at the center like a quiet warning to anyone who meant to step inside. The black car that had picked her up from the bus station stopped behind her, and the driver remained in the vehicle, silent the entire ride. He had only watched her in the rearview mirror with an empty gaze, as if she were nothing more than an item to be delivered to the correct address. A soft engine sound stirred, and then the gate began to swing open, slow and deliberate. Nora drew a deep breath and crossed the threshold. The Blackwood estate appeared before her like a palace from a fairy tale, but the kind of fairy tale people tell children to frighten them into obedience. A vast white building with dozens of tall windows, Greek stone columns holding up a wide portico, and a garden trimmed so perfectly it looked almost unreal. Yet what caught Nora's attention most wasn't the luxury or the scale of it. It was the silence. A silence so sharp it felt dangerous. She had worked in many places, from cramped apartments to elegant mansions, but never had she stepped into a place so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. There was no music, no conversation, no birdsong, no wind threading through leaves. This house was too large, too beautiful, and too silent for a place where people lived. It felt more like a museum than a home, where everything was preserved in flawless condition, but none of it carried the warmth of life. The front door opened, and an older woman appeared. Mrs. Harmon looked exactly the way Nora had imagined a housekeeper for a powerful family would look. Tall and thin, her back straight as a ruler despite her age, silver hair pulled into a tight bun without a single strand out of place, and a severe black outfit, as if she were on her way to a funeral. Her eyes swept over Nora from head to toe, measuring, judging, and then settling into a grudging acceptance. You're Nora Sinclair. Her voice was as cold as the house itself. Yes, ma'am. Follow me. I'll explain the rules. Nora followed Mrs. Harmon inside, her eyes constantly taking everything in. The great hall was enormous, the ceiling soaring high above, a crystal chandelier glittering overhead, and a spiral staircase curling up toward the upper floor. Everything was so clean it was almost blinding, as if no one had ever touched anything at all. Mrs. Harmon stopped in the center of the hall and turned to Nora with a strict gaze. There are 3 rules you must remember if you want to work here, she said, leaving no room for negotiation. First, you never enter the master's room unless you are called. Second, you don't ask about the past, about the family, or about anything that doesn't concern your work. Third, you don't make loud noise. Mr. Blackwood hates noise. Nora nodded, committing every word to memory. Mr. Blackwood doesn't like strangers, Mrs. Harmon went on, her voice dropping lower. He hired you because I asked him to, not because he wanted to. You work, you get paid, and you keep quiet. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, I understand. Nora was used to this. She was used to being treated as invisible, like a shadow moving through a house that no one truly noticed. It was how she had survived for the last 2 years, since she had lost everything. Mrs. Harmon studied her a moment longer, then nodded. One more thing, she said, and there was something in her voice Nora couldn't quite name. There's a child in the house, Mr. Blackwood's son. The boy has problems. Don't disturb the master when he's with the child. And don't ask about the boy. Nora wanted to ask what was wrong with the child, but she held it back. Rule number 2, don't ask. She only nodded in silence. Mrs. Harmon led Nora down to the basement, where there was a small room set aside for the help. It was just large enough for a narrow bed, an old wardrobe, and a small table pushed up against a window that looked out onto the backyard. Cold, but clean. Nora set her bag on the bed, looked around, and told herself she had lived in worse places than this. On her first day, Nora began to learn the work. She wiped down every room, every corner of the stairs, every expensive statue and vase. As she worked, she watched. The house was full of children's toys, plush bears perched on shelves, toy cars lined up in careful rows, bright picture books bursting with color. But there was no laughter, no babbling, no crying, no small demanding voice. Only a heavy silence pressing down everywhere. Late in the afternoon, as Nora was cleaning the staircase that led to the second floor, she heard a sound, a whisper, very soft, very faint, drifting from a room at the end of the hallway. She stopped and tilted her head to listen. It was a man's voice, low and rough, as if he were speaking to someone. But there was no answer, only that voice, steady and sorrowful, like a prayer recited into an empty room. Nora wanted to step closer, to hear more clearly. But then she remembered Mrs. Harmon's cold eyes and the rules she had laid down. Nora lowered her head, kept cleaning the stairs, and tried not to think about that mysterious room, or the child the housekeeper said had problems. On her third day at the Blackwood estate, Nora was assigned to clean the second-floor hallway. It was an area Mrs. Harmon usually avoided letting her near, but today the housekeeper's back was hurting and she had to lie down to rest, so the work was reassigned. Nora carried a bucket of water and a cleaning rag, stepping softly over the thick carpet so she wouldn't make a sound. She'd learned that silence was a rule of survival in this house. As she neared the end of the corridor, Nora realized the door to the room where she'd heard whispering on her first day was slightly open. A thin strip of pale yellow light spilled out from inside and lay across the floor. She knew she shouldn't look in. She remembered Mrs. Harmon's warning clearly, but her feet seemed to have a will of their own, moving her closer, slowly, until she could see. Kieran Blackwood was sitting in a rocking chair beside an oak crib, his back turned partly toward the doorway. It was the first time Nora had ever seen her employer, and she had to swallow down a sharp breath. He was much larger than she'd imagined, with broad shoulders pulled tight beneath a black shirt, and a long scar running from his jawbone down to his chin like a mark left by a violent past. His face looked carved from stone, angular and hard, and in the window's reflection she could make out his eyes, cold as ice in the cruelest Boston winter. This was the man the entire city feared. This was the Mafia boss, the rumors said, killed without hesitation. The one who had built an underground empire with the blood and tears of his enemies. Yet the way he held the baby in his arms was nothing like that. Gentle, careful, as if he were holding the most precious thing in the world, afraid that the smallest carelessness could make it shatter. Asher lay tucked against his father, small and fragile as a porcelain doll. Kieran was singing a lullaby under his breath, his voice rough and trembling, nothing like the terrifying figure people described. The melody was simple, the words old, perhaps a song someone had once sung to him when he was a child. Nora stood there, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too hard. She looked at Asher and felt her heart tighten. The baby's eyes were wide open, but they were empty, like two glass marbles, fixed on nothing, responding to nothing. He lay still as a small statue, not smiling, not crying, not waving his hands or kicking his feet the way ordinary babies did. Just as Mrs. Harmon had said, the boy had problems. Then Kieran stopped singing. He leaned his head against the edge of the crib, and his shoulders began to shake in uneven waves. Nora realized he was crying. There were no sobs, no choking sounds, only the silent trembling of his shoulders and tears she could see glinting on his cheeks in the soft yellow light. The most frightening man in Boston was crying like a helpless child before fate. Nora stepped back, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid Kieran might hear it. She left the hallway as quickly as she could, carrying that image in her mind. This man wasn't what the rumors said he was. Behind the cold, ruthless exterior was a father slowly dying of grief. In the days that followed, Nora found herself volunteering to clean the area near the nursery more often. She told Mrs. Harmon she wanted to keep the second floor spotless, and the housekeeper only nodded without asking anything further. From a distance, through doors left slightly ajar, Nora began to watch Asher, and she noticed strange things. Sometimes, when there was a loud sound, like a door slamming or Mrs. Harmon coughing in the hallway, the baby's tiny fingers would twitch. Not much, only a small jerk, as if he were reacting to noise. And one afternoon, when strong sunlight poured through the window into the nursery, Nora saw Asher's head tilt, just a little, toward the light. Only a little, only for a few seconds. But she saw it. Nora wasn't sure what she'd seen meant. Maybe it was only the body's natural reflex. Unconscious movements any child might have. But something in her instincts, the instincts from the time she'd studied to be a nurse before she lost everything, wouldn't let her dismiss it. She didn't tell anyone about what she'd observed. Who could she tell? Mrs. Harmon would think she was making things up to get attention, and Kieran Blackwood was someone she'd never dared to face directly. She kept those thoughts to herself, but her eyes never stopped watching whenever she had the chance. One evening, as Nora passed the nursery on her way down to the basement, after finishing her work, she stopped. The door was slightly open, and inside, Asher was lying alone in the crib. Kieran had likely gone somewhere, perhaps to the study the way he did every night. The soft yellow glow of a nightlight fell across the baby's small face, and his eyes were still open, staring up at the ceiling. But this time, Nora felt something strange, as if those small eyes weren't only looking into emptiness. As if they were waiting for something, or someone. She stood there for a long time, looking at the baby in the crib, and wondered whether she was imagining it. Nora had been working at the Blackwood estate for nearly 2 weeks when that fateful night arrived. She'd grown used to the house's silence, used to watching Asher from a distance, and used to avoiding Kieran Blackwood whenever she could. But that night, everything changed. Rapid knocking at her door jolted Nora awake from a thin, broken sleep. She sat bolt upright, her heart skittering out of control, and looked at the clock on the wall. 2 o'clock in the morning. Who would be knocking on her door at an hour like this? She hurriedly pulled a light sweater over her nightclothes and opened the door. A man stood there she'd never met face to face, though she'd seen him a few times from afar. Cole Hartley, Kieran Blackwood's bodyguard. He was tall and powerfully built, with close-cropped hair and eyes as sharp as a hawk's. But tonight, the tension showed plainly on the face that was usually cold and unreadable. "Miss Sinclair," Cole said quickly, his voice urgent. "The boss has to leave right now. There's an emergency." Nora blinked, not yet understanding what was happening. "What?" "Mrs. Harmon has a high fever and can't get up. I called a doctor for her, but she can't watch the boy." Cole stared straight into Nora's eyes. "You have to watch him." Nora felt as if someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over her head. "Me? But I've never," she stammered, panicked. "I'm just the housemaid. I don't know how to take care of." "There's no other choice," Cole cut her off, his voice firm. "The boss needs to go now, and you're the only person left in this house who can do it." Before Nora could protest again, a shadow appeared at the far end of the hallway. Kieran Blackwood walked toward them, wearing a long black wool coat, moving with haste yet still carrying that frightening authority. It was the first time Nora had ever faced her employer directly, and she had to force herself not to step back. He stood nearly a head taller than she did, and his steel-cold eyes swept over her from head to toe, measuring and judging. Nora felt as if she were being examined under a microscope. "You're the new housemaid?" Kieran asked, his voice low and icy. "Yes, sir." Nora fought to keep her voice steady. "Nora Sinclair." Kieran was silent for a moment, still looking at her as if he were trying to read what she was, whether she could be trusted. Then he spoke, word by word, slow and clear. "Bathe him and put him to sleep. Don't do anything else." Nora nodded. "I understand, sir." Kieran stepped closer, and Nora caught the faint scent of sandalwood on him. But what held her attention most was his eyes. Behind that layer of ice, she saw something else. Fear, worry, a father's love for his child. "If anything happens to my son," Kieran said, his voice dropping into the growl of an animal. The threat left unfinished, but clear enough for Nora to understand he was willing to do anything to protect his only boy. Nora swallowed, doing her best not to show her fear. "I'll take care of him carefully, sir. You can be at ease." Kieran watched her a moment longer, as if weighing whether he should believe her. Then he turned to Cole and gave a short nod. The two men moved quickly toward the stairs, and Nora heard their footsteps ringing on the marble floor. Before he disappeared around the bend of the staircase, Kieran stopped and looked back toward the nursery at the end of the hall, only for an instant. A brief, fleeting moment, but Nora saw the pain in that look, the wrenching struggle of a father forced to leave his child, even for a few hours. Then he walked on. The front door shut. The car engine turned over. And then, silence. Nora stood alone in the wide, dark hallway, with only weak moonlight coming through the windows. The house suddenly felt larger than it ever had, and she felt pitifully small inside it. A child needed her. A child she knew almost nothing about, except that he couldn't see and never responded to anything. Nora drew a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had studied nursing before she lost everything. She knew how to care for a small child. She could do this. She walked toward the nursery, each step a soft sound against the thick carpet. When she reached the door, she stopped, placed her hand on the knob, and slowly pushed it open. The soft yellow glow of the nightlight filled the room, casting gentle shadows along the walls. The oak crib stood in the center, and inside it, Asher lay awake. He wasn't sleeping. His small eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, empty and distant as always. Nora stepped closer and looked down at the baby. He was so small, so fragile, and so alone in that vast crib. She didn't know that tonight would change everything. She didn't know that what she was about to see would overturn everything people believed about this child. Nora looked around the nursery, trying to hold on to what Kieran had told her. Bathe the baby and put him to sleep. That was all. She could do that. She stepped into the small bathroom connected to the nursery, a room designed entirely for caring for an infant, with a white plastic baby tub set on a stand, bottles of baby shampoo and wash lined up neatly on a shelf, and soft terry towels hanging from hooks. Nora turned on the tap and adjusted the temperature until the water was comfortably warm, then filled the little tub. She lowered the lights so the glow would be gentle and not harsh on the baby's eyes, even though she knew that probably wasn't necessary for a child who couldn't see. When everything was ready, Nora went back into the nursery and walked to the crib. Asher was still lying there, his eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling, with no sign that he knew someone was standing beside him. Nora bent down carefully, slid a hand beneath his back and head, and lifted him up. He was feather light in her arms, warm and soft, but frighteningly quiet. There was no protesting cry at being roused, no babbling, no flailing hands or kicking feet, only silence. She undressed Asher from his tiny sleep clothes, each motion gentle and careful. His skin was rosy, white, and smooth, and Nora couldn't help thinking the child looked completely normal, completely healthy. If she hadn't been told beforehand, she would never have guessed anything was wrong with him. Nora carried Asher into the bathroom and slowly lowered him into the warm water. With one hand, she supported his head, and with the other, she scooped water and let it run over his body. Asher didn't react. He didn't flinch at the water, didn't soften into the warmth. He just lay there, eyes open and aimed at nothing, as if he were in an entirely different world. Nora took the bottle of baby wash from the shelf, poured a little into her palm, and worked it into foam. A light lavender scent spread through the air. She began to rub it gently over Asher's body, from shoulder to arm, from chest to belly, speaking softly to him as she worked, even though she knew he couldn't understand. It was a habit from her nursing training, always talking to patients whether they responded or not, to make the air feel less tense, or perhaps only to soothe herself. Nora raised her sudsy hand and blew lightly. Tiny soap bubbles floated upward, shimmering under the soft yellow light, spinning in the air before they burst. She smiled to herself, remembering the time she'd blown bubbles for Penny, her little sister, when Penny was small. Then she went still. Her heart seemed to stop. Asher's eyes were moving, not staring into emptiness the way they always did. They were following the bubbles. Nora didn't dare breathe. She was afraid the smallest movement, the slightest sound, would break the moment and prove she'd imagined it. But no, those tiny eyes kept tracking the last bubble until it popped on the surface of the water. Nora's hands trembled as she made more foam and blew again, slowly, deliberately. She watched every shift in Asher's gaze, and this time she was sure. His eyes were tracking, clearly, unmistakably. The bubbles drifted to the left, and his eyes moved left. The bubbles rose higher, and his eyes lifted. The bubbles fell, and his eyes dropped. Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks before she even realized she was crying. She looked around the bathroom for something else to test. On the shelf, there was a small silver spoon used for measuring the wash. She reached for it with her free hand and held it in front of Asher. The polished surface caught the light and glittered like a tiny star. Nora moved it slowly from left to right. Asher's eyes followed. She moved it from right to left. His eyes followed again. She lifted the spoon higher, then lowered it. Each time, every time, those little eyes followed the movement of the shining spoon. "Oh my God," Nora whispered, her voice breaking, tears now running in streams down her face. You can see. You can see. She set the spoon down and held her index finger in front of Asher, moving it back and forth. His eyes followed. She looked around and saw a yellow rubber duck on the shelf, grabbed it, and brought it into his line of sight. She moved the duck, and once again, those small eyes tracked every motion. Nora couldn't hold it in any longer. She lifted Asher out of the tub, wrapped him in a soft towel, and pulled him tight against her chest. She cried without sound, tears dropping onto the baby's fine, silken hair. This baby wasn't blind, Asher could see. But if he could see, why had he been silent for months? Why hadn't he responded to his father, to the people around him? Why had every doctor, every specialist, insisted he was blind from birth? Why had no one discovered what she had just seen? Nora held Asher close, feeling his small warmth against her, and her mind spun with a million questions. Something was wrong here. Very, very wrong. And she knew she had to speak the truth, even if it meant facing Kieran Blackwood, the most frightening man in Boston. Even if it meant losing her job, losing her place to stay, losing everything she had. She couldn't stay silent. Not when a child was trapped inside a lie no one seemed to notice. After she put Asher to sleep, Nora couldn't close her eyes. She sat in the chair by the window in her small basement room, staring out into the pitch-black night, her mind spinning with what she had just witnessed. Those tiny eyes had followed the soap bubbles. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't been mistaken. Asher could see. But how was she supposed to say this to Kieran Blackwood? How could she convince a man whose son had been declared blind from birth by dozens of doctors? She was only a housemaid, a nobody with no credentials, no standing. Who would believe her? And yet she couldn't stay silent. The image of Kieran crying beside the crib, the image of those broad shoulders shaking with grief, kept haunting her. That man was dying a little more every day for a child he believed would never see him. She had to tell him the truth, no matter what happened. When the clock crept toward 3 a.m, Nora heard a car pull up at the gate. She hurriedly threw on another layer and went up the stairs, waiting in the great hall. The front door opened and Kieran walked in, Cole Hartley behind him. Nora saw the exhaustion etched into her employer's face, the sharp angles of it somehow even colder under the yellow light. There were suspicious marks on his black coat, dark streaks Nora didn't want to think about too closely. Kieran was pulling off his gloves when he noticed her standing at the foot of the stairs. His brow tightened, his gaze sharpening instantly. Is something wrong? Is my son all right? Asher is all right, sir, Nora said, fighting to keep her voice steady. He's asleep. But I need to tell you something. Kieran let out a tired breath and moved past her toward the stairs. Tomorrow. I'm tired. Mr. Blackwood. Nora followed him in a reckless rush and stepped into his path, her heart hammering inside her ribs. Asher isn't blind. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Kieran stopped, his back still turned to her. Cole Hartley froze behind him, his eyes flicking quickly between the two of them. Then Kieran turned around, slowly, terrifyingly. The weariness in his eyes was gone now, replaced by something dangerous, like an animal that had been provoked. What did you just say? His voice dropped, almost a growl. Nora swallowed, but she didn't retreat. Your son isn't blind. He can see. Kieran moved closer, each step a quiet threat. He was much taller than she was, and standing in front of her like this, Nora felt so small it was hard to breathe. Who are you to say that? Kieran bit out each word. What do you know about my son? You've been here 2 weeks. I saw it with my own eyes. Nora forced her voice to hold steady. When I bathed him, I blew soap bubbles, and his eyes followed them. I moved a silver spoon in front of him, and his eyes followed that too. I tried with a toy, with my finger, and every time his eyes reacted, he can see. Mr. Blackwood. Kieran erupted. Are you out of your mind? He shouted, his voice echoing through the vast hall. The best doctors have examined my son. The top specialists have confirmed he was born blind. Who do you think you are? You're just a housemaid, someone who knows nothing, and you stand here telling me they're all wrong. Nora felt tears rising, but she forced them back. She understood his fury. He had hoped and been crushed too many times. He had been wounded too deeply. And now an unknown housemaid was telling him something that sounded like a cruel joke. What game are you playing? Kieran went on, his voice turning to ice. Do you want money? Or did someone send you here to torment me, to play with my pain? I'm not plotting anything, Nora said, her voice beginning to shake, though she still didn't move. "I'm only telling you what I saw. Get out of my house!" Kieran pointed toward the door, his eyes burning with anger. "Right now. I never want to see your face again." Nora stayed where she was. She knew she should be afraid. She knew the man in front of her could do anything to her, and no one would dare ask questions. But the image of Asher lying in the crib, those small eyes tracking the bubbles, made it impossible for her to walk away. "Check for yourself," she said, calmer than she expected. "Use a flashlight, use a brightly colored toy, move it in front of Asher and see whether his eyes respond. If I'm wrong, I'll leave without you having to throw me out. But if I'm right," she let the sentence hang. Kieran fell silent, his eyes still burning, but something else was stirring beneath it. Doubt. And deeper still, hidden behind the rage, a fragile thread of hope he was trying to crush. Or maybe it was fear. Fear of hoping and being disappointed again. Fear of believing and being betrayed. He stared at her for a long moment in tense silence. Cole Hartley stood behind him, not daring to move or speak. "Finally," Kieran said, his voice cold and blank. "Go back to your room." Then he turned and went up the stairs, his tall figure disappearing around the curve. Nora stood there and watched him go, her heart still pounding. She knew he would check. No matter how angry he was, no matter how much he didn't want to believe, he would check. Because that was his son. Because that was the only hope he had left. She only prayed she wasn't wrong. Because if she was, she would lose everything all over again. 4 o'clock in the morning, and Kieran Blackwood still hadn't slept. He sat in his study while firelight from the hearth danced across the tall bookcases, throwing strange shadows against the walls. The glass of whiskey in his hand was still full, not a single drop having touched his lips. He didn't want to drink. He couldn't drink. Not when the housemaid's words kept echoing in his head like a broken song that refused to end. He followed the soap bubbles. His eyes moved with everything. Asher isn't blind. Kieran clenched his teeth, trying to shove the thoughts away. It was only the word of a housemaid, a nameless stranger who had been here 2 weeks, with no medical degree, no expertise. What did she know about Asher's condition? Who was she to claim that every top doctor had been wrong? Dr. Harold Brennan, the pediatrician Boston respected, had declared Asher blind from birth. Specialists from New York, from the most prestigious hospitals, had reached the same conclusion. Kieran had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on examinations and treatment. There was no way they were all wrong. But if it was true... Kieran set the whiskey down on his desk, the sound of glass meeting wood cutting through the silence. He stared at the wedding photograph of himself and Catherine on the desk. Catherine was smiling in the picture, her eyes bright with happiness. If she were still alive, what would she say to him now? He knew the answer. Catherine would tell him to check. She would say that even if there was only 1 chance in a million, he had to try. Because that was their son. Because that was Asher. Kieran stood and left the study, climbing the staircase. Each step felt heavy, as if his boots were filled with lead, and his heart pounded harder with every stair he took. He stopped at the nursery door, his hand closing around the knob, and realized he was trembling. Kieran Blackwood, the man all of Boston feared, was shaking like a child. It had been years since his hands had trembled like this. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, closing it gently behind him. The soft yellow nightlight still glowed, and in the oak crib, Asher lay awake. His small eyes were half open, fixed on the ceiling the way they always were. Empty, distant, without life. Kieran moved closer and looked down at his son. He pulled a small flashlight from his coat pocket, the one he always carried. His hand shook so badly he could barely hold it steady. He drew in a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. Then he switched it on. A small white beam lit the ceiling, and Kieran slowly lowered it, bringing it into Asher's range of sight. He moved the light to the left, carefully, slowly. His heart nearly stopped. Asher's eyes moved with it. Kieran stopped breathing. He moved the light to the right. Asher's eyes followed. He raised the light higher. Those tiny eyes lifted. He lowered the light. Those eyes dropped. No, it couldn't be. Kieran shut off the flashlight, his hand shaking violently. He looked around the room and saw the bright yellow teddy bear he'd bought for Asher months ago. The bear Asher had never looked at, never once reached for. He picked it up and brought it into his son's line of sight. He moved it left, right, higher, lower. Every time, Asher's tiny eyes followed. Kieran collapsed beside the crib. His knees struck the hardwood floor, but he didn't feel the pain. He didn't feel anything except the enormous wave of emotion crashing over him and dragging him under. Tears spilled down his face, tears he had forced back for months. You can see your father," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You can see your father, Asher. You can see." As if he heard Kieran's voice, Asher turned his head toward him. Those small eyes looked into Kieran's face, and even though there was no smile, no babbling sound, it was the first time Kieran felt his son was truly seeing him. He reached into the crib, lifted Asher up, and held him tight against his chest. He cried without restraint, ragged sobs sounding in the silent room. All the suffering, all the despair, all the long, lonely nights, everything burst open in this single moment. His son wasn't blind. Asher could see. But then, in the middle of the joy and relief, another question began to form in Kieran's mind. If his son wasn't blind, why hadn't he reacted for months? Why had every doctor insisted he was blind from birth? Why had Dr. Harold Brennan, the man he trusted, told him there was no hope? Who had done this, and why? Kieran placed Asher back in the crib, gently but with finality. He stood up, and when he caught his reflection in the mirror on the wall, he saw that his eyes were dry. No more tears, no more grief, only coldness, and anger boiling deep inside him. Someone had deliberately harmed his son. Someone had made him believe Asher would never see. Someone had stolen precious months from this child's life, and someone was going to pay. Early the next morning, as the sun was just beginning to rise through the trees surrounding the estate, Cole Hartley knocked on the door of Nora's basement room. "The boss wants to see you." In the study, right now. His voice carried no emotion at all, and that only made Nora more anxious. She nodded, quickly straightened her hair and clothes, and followed Cole up the stairs. Every step felt heavy, and she braced herself for the worst. She was going to be fired. She had dared to challenge the most powerful mafia boss in Boston, dared to tell him that he and every doctor were wrong. Whether she was right or wrong, a man like Kieran Blackwood would never accept being humiliated by an unknown housemaid. She would be forced to leave, once again losing her place to stay, losing her job, returning to a life of drifting with no idea what tomorrow would bring. Cole stopped at the study door, knocked twice, then opened it for Nora to enter. The room was vast, lined with bookcases that rose to the ceiling, the fireplace long since gone cold, and morning light spilling in through the large window at the far end. Kieran stood there with his back to her, looking out at the garden beyond. He was still wearing the clothes from the night before, unchanged, unslept. The door closed behind Nora, and silence settled over the room. She stood with her hands clenched together, waiting for the storm to break over her head. But Kieran said nothing. He simply stood there, silent, and the silence stretched so long Nora felt as if she might suffocate inside it. Then he turned around. Nora saw his eyes were bloodshot, dark bruised shadows beneath them, exhaustion carved into every hard line of his face. But there was something else in his gaze, something she had never seen before. "You were right," Kieran said, his voice raw. 3 simple words, and Nora could hardly believe she'd heard them. She stayed still, not knowing how to react, not knowing what to say. Kieran stepped closer, and she could see how hard he was working to force out what came next. His lips moved as if the words were stuck in his throat, refusing to come free. "I'm sorry," he finally managed. "About last night. About what I said to you." Nora couldn't believe it. Kieran Blackwood was apologizing to her, the most feared mafia boss in Boston, the man no one dared meet eye to eye, was standing in front of her and speaking an apology. She could see how difficult it was for him, as if it had been years since he'd lowered himself like this to anyone. "I checked," Kieran went on, his voice trembling slightly. My son can see. You were right." Nora let out a shaky breath, a piece of the weight on her shoulders finally lifting. "I'm glad you believe me, Mr. Blackwood." "I'm glad, Asher." Kieran looked at her, his eyes still holding something hard to read. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice dropping. "You're only the housemaid. You have no reason to care about my son. So why?" Nora was quiet for a moment, weighing what she should say. Then she chose to tell the truth, at least part of it. "Because I used to be a nurse," she said, gentle but steady. "Before I lost everything, I was trained to observe, to notice signs other people might miss. And when I looked at Asher, I saw things I couldn't stay silent about." Kieran lifted an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the information. But he didn't ask more about her past, didn't push into what she had lost. Maybe he understood there were wounds that shouldn't be touched. "I need you to stay," he said after a moment. I need you to help me figure out what's happening with my son. Why he hasn't reacted for months. Why every doctor said he was blind when he isn't. Something is very wrong here, and I need the truth." Nora didn't hesitate. "I'll stay." Kieran nodded, then turned to his desk and picked up the phone. "I'm calling another doctor," he said as he dialed. "Someone I trust to give me real answers, not the lies I've been hearing for months." That night, after everyone in the estate had gone to sleep, Nora sat alone in the vast kitchen. She didn't turn on the main light. Only the dim glow from a small lamp over the stove softened the quiet space. In front of her was a cup of tea that had gone cold long ago, and she wrapped both hands around it as if she could draw warmth from something that was already chilled. Tears slid down her cheeks, and she couldn't stop them. They came in silence, falling onto the oak tabletop, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Today was Penny's death anniversary. 2 years ago, on this exact day, her little sister had taken her last breath in Nora's arms. And even though time had passed, the pain was still there, still raw, like a wound that had never truly healed. Soft footsteps sounded, and Nora lowered her head quickly, trying to hide her tear-streaked face. Kieran stepped into the kitchen, clearly unable to sleep as well. He paused when he saw her, and for a moment they both went still. Nora thought he would leave. She wanted him to leave. She didn't want anyone to see her like this, fragile and undone. But Kieran didn't go. He stood there for a moment as if weighing something, then walked to the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, and instead of leaving, pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't try to comfort her. He just sat there, silent, waiting. And it was that silence, that presence without judgment, that made something in Nora break open. She didn't know why she started to speak. Maybe because it had been too long since she'd had anyone to talk to. Maybe because, in the darkness of this kitchen, with a man she barely knew sitting across from her, she felt safe enough to let the truth out. Her voice was uneven, catching in her throat, but she told him anyway. "I used to be a nurse in training," she began, her eyes fixed on the cold tea, "at the largest hospital in Boston. I loved that work. I thought it was the road I'd walk for the rest of my life." She stopped and drew a shaky breath. "My little sister, Penny, was only 5 years old. She had a congenital heart condition. The doctors said she needed surgery urgently, or else." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Then one day, medicine went missing from the hospital's supply room, and somehow, all the evidence pointed to me. I was framed as the culprit. Her voice turned bitter. "I was fired immediately. My nursing certification was revoked. No hospital would take me again. My name was smeared everywhere." Nora lifted her gaze, and Kieran was still listening, his eyes never leaving her. "Without work, I had no money, no insurance. Penny couldn't get the surgery." Her voice cracked. 3 months later, she died. In my arms. She was only 5 years old. Tears were streaming down Nora's face now. "My parents blamed me. They said if I hadn't been fired, Penny would have had the money for surgery. They disowned me. They threw me out of the house." She let out a bitter laugh. "After that, I drifted. I did whatever I could. Cleaning, washing dishes, doing laundry, anything to survive one day at a time. I became invisible. No one saw me. No one cared who I was, or what I used to be." She looked straight into Kieran's eyes. "I couldn't save my sister, but when I look at Asher, I see Penny. I see a child trapped, a child who needs someone to truly see him, and I couldn't stay silent. Not this time." Silence filled the kitchen. Kieran didn't speak for a long time, and Nora thought maybe she'd said too much, shown too much of her weakness. Then he finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You couldn't save your sister, but you saved my son." He looked at her, and in those cold eyes Nora saw something she hadn't expected. "Respect. That matters," he said. To me, Nora felt something inside her chest loosen, a knot she'd been carrying for 2 years. For the first time since Penny died, she felt seen by someone, not as a housemaid, not as someone invisible, but as a human being. 2 days after the conversation in the kitchen, a glossy black sedan pulled up in front of the gates of the Blackwood estate. A middle-aged woman stepped out, small in stature yet carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that matter. Her silver hair was cut short and neat, gold-rimmed glasses rested on the bridge of a high nose, and a brown leather case hung from her hand. Dr. Margaret Wells, Boston's leading ophthalmologist, the only person Kieran Blackwood trusted in this field. He had met her 3 years earlier, in an incident he would never forget. One man in his organization had been attacked, a shard of glass driven deep into his eye, and every other doctor had said he'd be blind forever. But Dr. Wells had done what seemed impossible. She had saved that eye, saved the man's livelihood with it. And from that day on, Kieran knew that if anyone could give him a real answer about Asher's condition, it would be her. Cole Hartley escorted Dr. Wells into the estate, and Kieran met her in the great hall. They exchanged a few brief words, then went upstairs together to the nursery on the second floor. Nora had been told ahead of time, and was already waiting inside, Asher in her arms, freshly bathed and dressed in clean clothes. Dr. Wells entered the room and her gaze went straight to the child. She set her leather case on the table, opened it, and took out specialized instruments. "Put the boy on the bed for me," she said to Nora, her voice gentle but professional. Nora did as she was told, laying Asher carefully on the small bed used for changing. The baby lay still, eyes open but not fixed on anything in particular. Dr. Wells began her examination. She used a small clinical light and shone it into Asher's eyes, watching the pupil response. She gave a slight nod and wrote something in her notebook. "The pupillary reflex is normal," she said. "The pupil constricts with strong light." Next, she took a small bright red ball and moved it slowly across Asher's field of view. Nora held her breath as she watched. And just as she had seen that night in the bath, Asher's tiny eyes moved with the ball, left to right to left, clear and certain. Dr. Wells tested several more times with different objects, making notes without stopping. She checked light response at varying intensities, and Asher responded to every change. His eyes were fully sensitive to light, tightening when it was too bright, widening when the glow softened. After nearly half an hour of careful testing, Dr. Wells sat back in the chair beside the bed, her expression grave. Kieran stood across from her, arms folded over his chest, trying to contain the anxiety boiling inside him. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Wells began, her voice slow and deliberate. "The boy's eyes are completely normal structurally. There's no sign of congenital blindness. The cornea is clear, the retina is healthy, the optic nerve shows no physical damage." Kieran drew in a deep breath. Then why didn't he respond for months? And why did every other doctor say my son was blind? Dr. Wells fell quiet for a moment, her eyes lowered to Asher, lying motionless on the bed. "Something suppressed his visual nervous system," she said. "Not genetic, not trauma, external influence." She looked up at Kieran. "Has the boy been taking any medication? Any medication prescribed after birth?" Kieran turned to Cole with a signal. Cole left immediately and returned minutes later with a medical file. Kieran handed it to Dr. Wells. "This is everything my son's been given since he was born. Most of it was prescribed by Dr. Harold Brennan, the pediatrician." Dr. Wells opened the file and her eyes moved across page after page. Then she stopped on one page, and her face changed. Her brows drew together. Her mouth tightened into a hard line. "This drug," she said, indicating a line in the record. "Who prescribed this for the boy?" Kieran looked down. It was the medication Dr. Brennan had said would stimulate Asher's nervous system. "Dr. Brennan. He said it was developmental support for infants." Dr. Wells shook her head, and now her expression wasn't only serious. It held anger. "This medication isn't permitted for infants. It has extremely severe side effects in children under 1 year old. It suppresses the visual nervous system, disrupts the connection between the eyes and the brain, and makes a child unable to process images even when the eyes still function normally. It also numbs emotional response, so the child doesn't smile, doesn't cry, doesn't react to the world around him." The room fell into a heavy silence. Nora lifted a hand to cover her mouth, unable to believe what she was hearing. Kieran stood very still, his face turned to stone, but in his eyes a dangerous fire had caught. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Wells said slowly, each word like a nail driven into the air. "I don't know what reason Dr. Brennan had for prescribing this to your son, but in my experience, no competent pediatrician makes that kind of mistake. This isn't negligence." She looked straight into Kieran's eyes. "I think your son was poisoned, deliberately." Kieran didn't say a word as Dr. Wells packed up her instruments and left the nursery. He stood there like a statue, his face giving nothing away, but his eyes were burning with a fire Nora had never seen in anyone. Not ordinary anger, but the fury of a father who had just learned his child had been harmed on purpose. After Cole saw Dr. Wells out to the gate and came back, Kieran was already waiting in the study. He stood by the window with his back to the door, and when he heard Cole's footsteps, He spoke without turning around, telling him to find everything on Dr. Harold Brennan, bank accounts, calls, texts, emails, everyone he had contacted, everywhere he had gone, everything, because he wanted to know it all. Cole nodded and didn't ask a single question. He had worked for Kieran long enough to know when to stay silent and carry out orders. The study door closed, and Kieran sank back into the darkness of that vast room, alone with the black thoughts twisting through his mind. 3 days later, Cole Hartley returned to the estate with a thick file in his hand. He walked into the study, where Kieran had spent most of the past days, waiting for this information. Nora was there too, standing in the corner, watching with anxious eyes. Cole said he had found it, setting the file on Kieran's desk, and warned that Kieran wouldn't like what was inside. Kieran opened the file and began to read. With every page he turned, his face grew darker, his eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched so hard Nora could see the tendons stand out along his neck. The first page was a copy of Dr. Harold Brennan's bank statement. A large sum, $500,000, had been transferred into Brennan's account just a few days after Asher was born. The money came from an anonymous overseas account. The next pages held Cole's tracing results. He had used every connection he had in the underworld to find where the money truly came from, and the name at the end of the chain hit Kieran like lightning. Vince Morello, Kieran's biggest rival in Boston's underworld, the man Kieran had fought for years over control of shipping routes and spheres of influence, an enemy beyond reconciliation. Kieran kept turning pages, and the full shape of the plot came into focus with a clarity that felt monstrous. Cole had recovered encrypted messages between Brennan and a phone number registered under a false name but belonging in truth to one of Morello's men. The messages showed that everything had been planned in advance. Vince Morello had tried to kill Kieran with a bomb planted in his car, but that day Catherine had taken Kieran's car to go shopping for Asher, the child she was carrying, and she died in her husband's place. Asher was born early because of the shock of the explosion, and his mother did not survive. When the assassination plan failed, Morello moved to a second plan. He could not kill Kieran, but he could destroy him from the inside, make Kieran's only son, the heir to the Blackwood Empire, into someone useless. A blind heir would be the greatest humiliation to the Blackwood bloodline. It would ruin Kieran not through death, but through despair. Dr. Brennan, with his reputation and the trust people gave him, had been chosen to carry out that plan. He prescribed the harmful drug to Asher from the earliest days, then assured Kieran the baby was blind from birth and there was no treatment. A perfect conspiracy. The crack of splintering wood rang out in the study. Kieran had slammed his fist down on the oak desk with terrifying force, splitting it clean down the middle. Nora startled back, while Cole remained still, long accustomed to the storms that lived inside his employer. Kieran roared that they would die. Brennan, Morello, all of them, that he would tear them apart one by one. He lunged for the door, his eyes bloodshot, every rational thought drowned beneath rage. He would go to Brennan's house right now. He would wrap these hands around the throat of the man who had poisoned his son. He would, but Nora stepped in front of the doorway with her arms spread wide. She knew it was madness, knew she was standing before a beast in the grip of a frenzy, but she could not let him go. Kieran snarled at her to move, his eyes on her like she was an obstacle to be removed. Nora said that if he killed Brennan, he would go to prison, and Asher would lose his father. And did he want that? Did he want his son to grow up without a father beside him, the way the boy had already lost his mother? Kieran stopped as if a blade had driven into his chest. His breathing was heavy, his broad shoulders rising and falling, but his feet did not move forward. Nora told him to let the law handle it, to gather evidence, to take Brennan to court, to let the whole world see what Dr. Harold Brennan truly was, to make him lose everything, his reputation, his career, his freedom, because that was the punishment he deserved. And if Kieran killed him, he would only give him an easy death and destroy his own life in the process. Kieran looked at her, the fire of fury still alive in his eyes, but behind it, reason began to return, slow and reluctant. He thought of Asher, of those tiny eyes that could follow light, of the future he wanted to build for his son. And he knew Nora was right. After a long silence, Kieran told Cole to contact his lawyer and prepare everything to take the case to court. For the first time in his life, Kieran Blackwood, the most feared mafia boss in Boston, chose the lawful path, for his son, and for the woman standing in front of him, the woman who had dared to block his way when the entire world would have been too afraid to try. Under Dr. Margaret Wells's supervision, Asher was taken completely off the harmful drug Dr. Brennan had prescribed. She came to the Blackwood estate twice a week to monitor the baby's recovery, and with each visit she brought better news. Asher's small body was gradually clearing the poison, and his nervous system was slowly reconnecting with the outside world. In the first week, the changes were tiny, but they were enough to bring hope. Asher's eyes began to focus on objects instead of drifting aimlessly the way they had before. When Nora held the yellow teddy bear in front of him, his small eyes no longer looked through it. They truly looked at it, as if he were trying to understand what was there. Dr. Wells explained that his brain was learning again how to process images after months of suppression. The second week brought clearer progress. Asher began to track movement with his eyes on purpose. His head turned when Nora moved around the room, and his ears perked whenever a sound appeared. One afternoon, when Mrs. Harmon accidentally dropped a tray in the kitchen, Asher startled and turned his head toward the noise. It was the first time he reacted to sound consciously, and Nora had to step out of the room so she could cry alone with joy. In the third week, the miracle truly happened. Kieran was sitting on the nursery floor with Asher, following the guidance of a therapist Dr. Wells had recommended. He needed to interact with his son more, using facial expressions and his voice to stir a response. Kieran Blackwood, the cold, frightening Mafia boss, was sitting on the floor, making silly faces for his little boy. He puffed out his cheeks, wrinkled his nose, stuck out his tongue, and made ridiculous sounds he'd never imagined he could make. Nora stood in the doorway, watching the strange sight with a small smile on her lips. And then it happened. Asher looked at his father, those small eyes focusing on Kieran's contorted face. Then the corner of his mouth lifted, and he smiled. The first smile, the first laugh, a small, clear sound that rang through the room like a bell. Kieran went still. He stared at his son laughing, the tiny eyes bright, the plump cheeks flushed pink, and it felt as if the world had stopped turning. He didn't know how long he had been waiting for this moment. He didn't know how deep his despair had been when he believed he would never hear his child's laughter. And now that laughter was filling the room, real, alive, impossible. Kieran pulled Asher into his arms, tears sliding down his face without any attempt to hide them. He cried the way he had never cried in front of anyone, crying from happiness, from relief, from the sense that all the suffering of the past months had finally led to something that mattered. Nora stood at the door with tears in her eyes, witnessing a moment she knew she would never forget. A child's laughter was heard in the Blackwood estate for the first time in nearly a year. From that day on, Nora spent more time with Asher. The soap bubble game became their ritual. Every bath, she blew shimmering bubbles, and Asher reached out with his tiny hands to catch them, giggles bubbling up each time a bubble popped against his soft skin. She sang him lullabies she had once sung to Penny, and this time, the child in her arms was listening, responding, living. Asher began to cling to Nora in a way he had never clung to anyone. He cried when she left the room, his small eyes following her with worry, and he beamed every time she returned, arms stretching out to be held. The bond between them grew deeper each day, a bond that needed no words, no explanations, only the simplest and purest kind of trust and love. Kieran watched it all from a distance. He saw the way Nora cared for his son, the way she spoke to him, the way she smiled at him. And inside Kieran, a strange feeling began to rise. A feeling he had believed had died with Catherine. The Blackwood estate was no longer a museum of grief. The cold rooms now held laughter. The silent hallways now carried hurried footsteps searching for a baby's toy. And the hearts of the people living inside it, little by little, were growing warm again. 2 months after the plot was exposed, Dr. Harold Brennan was arrested in his own luxurious home in a Boston suburb. Federal agents came in at 6 a.m. and cuffed him in front of his wife and children, while neighbors stood outside watching with stunned faces. The news spread like wildfire. Boston's most famous pediatrician, the man upper-class families had trusted completely, was accused of deliberately prescribing the wrong medication to harm an infant and of taking bribes from a criminal organization. The press swarmed the story, and the tale of the Mafia boss Kieran Blackwood and the son who had been made blind became the hottest topic across every newspaper front page and television broadcast. The trial was held in federal court in Boston on an early winter day, when the last leaves had already fallen from the branches, and the sky was the same flat gray as the mood of the people walking into the courtroom. Outside the building, dozens of reporters crowded together, cameras flashing nonstop, microphones thrust forward whenever anyone stepped through the main doors. Kieran Blackwood sat in the first row behind the prosecution table, wearing his usual black suit, his face cold as stone. He didn't look toward the defendant. He didn't even spare a glance for the man who had poisoned his son. His presence in the courtroom was statement enough. Nora sat beside Kieran, and she didn't know when his hand had found hers. Maybe it was when the prosecutor began laying out the charges, or when photographs of Asher during those months of suffering were displayed on a screen. Nora didn't pull away. She could feel the strain in Kieran's fingers, the rage he was forcing down, and she understood that sometimes even the strongest people need something solid to hold on to. The evidence came in piece by piece, building a complete picture of Dr. Brennan's crime. Bank records showing $500,000 transferred into his account. Decoded messages between him and men connected to Vince Morello. Witness testimony, including nurses who had worked with Brennan and noticed strange signs but didn't dare speak up. And most important, the medical report from Dr. Margaret Wells, detailing the harm caused by the drug Brennan had prescribed for Asher. Then it was Nora's turn to be called to the witness stand. She walked beneath the curious stares of everyone in the courtroom, feeling as if she were stripped bare under hundreds of eyes. She sat in the witness chair, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor began asking questions, and Nora told the story of that night, the night she was assigned to bathe Asher, the night she blew soap bubbles and saw those tiny eyes follow the shimmering spheres. Her voice shook, but every word came out clear and sure. She told the jury that she wasn't a doctor, that she was only a housemaid, but she had seen it. She had seen a child everyone claimed was blind from birth tracking soap bubbles. She had seen his eyes move, follow, react, and she had known something wasn't right. Brennan's defense attorney stood, wearing an expression of practiced confidence. He walked closer to the stand and looked at Nora with open contempt. He addressed her by name and, in a mocking tone, reminded her that she was only a housemaid, that she had no medical degree, no expertise in ophthalmology or neurology, and asked how she dared to claim the child wasn't blind when dozens of qualified doctors had concluded the opposite. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for Nora's answer. She drew in a deep breath and met the attorney's eyes. She said she wasn't diagnosing anything. She said she had only seen a baby follow soap bubbles, and that you don't need credentials to see that. Anyone with eyes and a heart can see that. The problem, she said, was that the people with credentials had chosen not to look. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy. The defense attorney stood there, suddenly unsure what to say next, then returned to his seat without asking another question. Dr. Margaret Wells testified afterward, laying out in detail the effects of the drug Brennan had prescribed, how it suppressed an infant's visual nervous system, how it disrupted the link between eye and brain, and how no competent doctor makes a mistake like that unless it's deliberate. Her testimony sealed Dr. Harold Brennan's fate. The jury left to deliberate and returned in less than an hour. When the judge read the verdict, Dr. Brennan stood pale, his hands trembling. The jury found the defendant Harold Brennan guilty on all charges. His license was revoked permanently. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The gavel struck, and officers moved in to cuff Brennan. Kieran rose from his seat, and for the first time during the entire trial, he looked at the man who had poisoned his son. His gaze was cold, not hatred, not fury, only absolute contempt. He didn't need to speak. That look was enough to make Brennan understand he was lucky the law had taken him, not the hands of Kieran Blackwood. Vince Morello would also be prosecuted in a separate trial for conspiracy to harm a child and many other charges, but that was for another day. Today, justice had been done for Asher. As they stepped out of the courthouse, Kieran took Nora's hand amid the crush of reporters. He didn't care about the shouted questions. He didn't care about the relentless flash of cameras. He only looked at her and said, softly, with a weight of meaning behind it, "It's over." Nora nodded, tightening her grip on his hand. It's over. After the trial, life in the Blackwood estate slowly returned to peace. The storm had passed, the traitors had been punished, and now what remained was the quiet of ordinary days. But it was a different kind of quiet, no longer heavy and suffocating the way it had been before, but warm and full of life. Asher was completely healthy now. The baby, nearly 1 year old, crawled all over the house, chasing colorful balls as they rolled across the floor, reaching out to catch the toy butterflies hanging over his crib. His eyes shone bright, his plump cheeks stayed rosy, and his laughter rang out every day like the sweetest music this estate had ever heard. Kieran spent more time with his son, and with Nora too. He no longer locked himself in the study until late at night. He came home earlier, sat on the floor and played with Asher, read books to him even though the baby didn't understand a single word yet. And after Asher fell asleep, he and Nora often sat together in the living room by the fireplace, talking about all kinds of things. One night, Kieran began to speak about Catherine. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife since Nora arrived at the estate. "She loved sunflowers," he said, his voice low and far away. "She said sunflowers always turn toward the sun, and she wanted to live like that, always turning toward the light no matter how much darkness surrounded her." He paused, a faint smile passing over his mouth. "She loved to dance in the rain. Whenever it rained, she'd run out into the yard, spin in circles, laughing loud. I used to think she was crazy." Nora listened in silence, without judging, without comparing. She understood Kieran needed to say these things, needed to remember the woman he had loved and lost. "She was the only one who wasn't afraid of me," Kieran continued, his voice softer now. "She saw the monster I was, and she stayed anyway. She said even monsters deserve to be loved." In the weeks that followed, Kieran began to pull back from the dangerous work of the underworld. He handed more control to people he trusted, cut down on meetings in the dark, and spent more time living an ordinary life. He wanted to live. For Asher, and for something beginning to grow inside him, a feeling he had believed died with Catherine. But while Kieran was opening up, Nora was drawing inward. She was afraid. She had lost everything once already. Her sister, her family, her career. She knew what it felt like to have happiness ripped out of her hands. And she didn't dare believe this time would be different. She didn't dare trust the gentle looks Kieran gave her. She didn't dare trust the warmth she felt whenever his hand brushed hers. Because if she believed, and if she lost it again, she didn't know if she could survive it. One night, when the estate had fallen completely asleep, Nora quietly packed her belongings into the small cloth bag she had carried on her first day. She had to go, before it was too late, before she loved too deeply and couldn't leave anymore. She was walking down the hallway toward the stairs, when a voice rose behind her. "Where are you going?" Nora stopped short, her back rigid. She didn't turn around. She didn't dare meet his eyes. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice trembling. You are the light that stepped into my darkness." Kieran cut her off, his voice both fierce and strangely gentle. "Don't go." Nora turned, and she saw him standing there in the dark hallway, his eyes holding an emotion she didn't dare name. "Stay," he said, stepping closer. "Not for Asher. For me." Nora looked at him, her eyes burning, tears sliding down her cheeks before she could stop them. And slowly, she set the bag down on the floor. That night, for the first time since Penny died, Nora slept without nightmares. Nora was still standing on the stage, not knowing what to say. Hundreds of eyes were on her. Hundreds of faces were smiling at her. Yet she felt as if she were standing inside a dream that couldn't possibly be real. She looked down at the medal with its silver ribbon resting against her chest, her hand trembling slightly as she touched it. Guardian of the Light. That was what they called her. Her, Nora Sinclair, the nameless housemaid, the woman who had once wandered Boston's cold streets with no idea what tomorrow would bring. Footsteps sounded across the stage, and Nora turned. Kieran was walking toward her with Asher in his arms. The boy was nearly 1 year old now, cheeks plump, eyes bright and shining, nothing like the silent statue of a baby she had met months earlier. Kieran stopped beside her, and Asher looked at Nora. Those tiny eyes recognized her instantly, lighting up like 2 small stars. He reached his little arms toward her, his small fingers curling and uncurling, asking to be held. The entire hall went quiet. Hundreds of people holding their breath, not quite knowing what they were waiting for, only that something was about to happen. Nora smiled and bent down to take Asher from Kieran's arms. And then, in that moment, the miracle happened. Clear and strong, Asher spoke. "Mommy." Time seemed to stop. Nora stood frozen, eyes wide. She stopped breathing. Her heart seemed to stop beating. The whole world narrowed until there was only her and the baby reaching for her. "Mommy." That wasn't a random sound children babble. That wasn't meaningless noise from a child learning to talk. It was a word with meaning. It was a choice. Asher had chosen that word for her. For the person he trusted. For the person he loved. For the person who had seen him when the whole world believed he was blind. Tears poured down Nora's cheeks, and she couldn't hold them back. She took Asher from Kieran, pulled him tight against her, and cried in broken, shaking sobs. She cried from happiness. She cried from sheer emotion. She cried because for the first time in 2 years, she felt loved, needed, called by the most sacred name any woman could ever long to hear. Applause erupted across the hall. The entire room rose to its feet, thunderous clapping rolling on and on. Many people were crying too, tears of being moved by a moment so beautiful and so honest. Kieran stepped closer and placed his large hand on Nora's shoulder. His voice was thick when he spoke, low enough that only she could hear. You earned that title, more than anyone. Nora looked at him through her tears, unable to speak. She only nodded, holding Asher tighter, feeling the baby's small warmth against her chest. And then, in spite of the solemn moment, Asher began to chew on the silver ribbon of the medal. He clamped his mouth onto it, drool spilling down, utterly unconcerned that hundreds of people were watching him. Nora laughed through her tears, a bright, happy sound that broke loose all at once. She looked down at the baby in her arms, chewing the medal with complete satisfaction, and she felt her heart fill with something she had believed was gone forever. Mommy. That word wasn't only a call. It was recognition. It was unconditional love. It was family. It was the answer to every sorrow she had endured. It was the reward for every night she had cried alone, missing Penny, wondering why she was still alive. She couldn't save her little sister, but she had saved Asher. And somehow, Asher had saved her too. For the first time since Penny died, Nora felt she belonged somewhere. She wasn't a drifting stranger anymore. She had a family. She had a child who had chosen her as his mother. And Asher, the baby everyone believed couldn't see anything, had been seeing her for a long time. He had seen her when she blew soap bubbles on that first night. He had seen her when she sang him lullabies every evening. He had seen her with his heart, even before his eyes recovered. And he had chosen her. Mommy. The three of them returned to Boston beneath the brilliant sunset of a late autumn afternoon. The sky looked like an oil painting. Layers of orange, pink, and purple melting into one another, creating a scene so beautiful it ached. Kieran's black car glided smoothly along the familiar road leading back to the suburbs, and in the back seat, Asher had fallen asleep on Nora's shoulder at some point without her even noticing. His tiny hand clutched the hem of her blouse, as if even in sleep he didn't want to let go of the woman he had called mother. His breathing was steady, warm against Nora's neck, and his small lips moved now and then, as if he were dreaming of something tender and bright. Nora sat perfectly still, not daring to shift, afraid she might wake him. She looked out the window at the fading sunset and felt a kind of peace she had never known before. The car stopped at the gates of the Blackwood estate, and Kieran turned off the engine. He didn't get out right away. He sat for a moment, looking toward the back seat where Nora held Asher in her arms. The two most important people in his life, the woman who had brought light back into this dark house, and the son he had nearly lost. Kieran opened the car door, stepped out, then walked around to the other side to open the door for Nora. When she climbed out, still holding Asher fast asleep, he looked at her and spoke gently. Thank you for staying. Nora lifted her eyes to him and smiled. Thank you for giving me a family. They walked into the estate, and Nora noticed at once that something had changed. The house no longer felt cold and shadowed the way it had on her first day. The white walls seemed warmer now, the long hallways felt shorter, and the air no longer carried the weight of morning. That night, after she bathed Asher and got him clean, Nora laid him gently into the familiar oak crib. He turned, found a comfortable position, and drifted on. His breathing stayed even, and his lips curved into a small smile, as if he were having a lovely dream. Nora sat down in the rocking chair beside the crib and watched him. Her child. She thought of Penny, the little sister she hadn't been able to save. But this time the memory didn't come with the old tearing pain. There was only peace and gratitude. Gratitude that she had met Asher. Gratitude that she had been given a chance to be a mother. Kieran stood in the nursery doorway, silently watching the two of them. He didn't speak. He simply stood there with a smile on his mouth. A real smile. Not forced. Not hidden. The first smile since Catherine had died. The Blackwood estate was no longer a museum of grief. It was home, a home of love, a home of hope, a home of small miracles, the kind we sometimes find in the places we least expect. And it had all begun with a little soap foam. Sometimes, miracles don't come from the top experts or the most expensive medical equipment. Sometimes, miracles come from the most ordinary people, the ones who know how to see with their hearts instead of only with their eyes. Nora didn't save Asher with medicine or technology. She saved him with attention, with love, with the courage to speak the truth when the entire world told her to stay quiet. And in return, Asher saved her. He gave her a family, a reason to keep living, a chance to be called Mom. This story reminds us to never underestimate the power of care and compassion. Don't ever stay silent when you see something that isn't right, and don't ever give up hope, because miracles can come from the places you least expect. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new moving stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in real life? Leave a comment below. We'd truly love to hear what you feel deep in your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a happy life, and days filled with peace. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.